So you'll notice that Hojo-san is not here. It is not a figment of your imagination. He is home with Azusa, his wife, and apparently she is ill, and so he is staying home to be, out of, as we used to say during COVID, we probably should still continue to say, out of an abundance of caution. So, so I step forward to offer a talk this morning. We'll see how it goes. This is one of those last-minute things. In any case, I thought, I wasn't here last Sunday, but I did listen to the talk online. So I know that Hojo-san began talking about Rohatsu and kind of the stories around the Buddha's home leaving. So I'm not going to pretend to continue what he was going to say because I have no idea. But I thought I would talk about renunciation, because I think it's a word we don't really like so much in our culture. I mean, I'm kind of afraid of it at times. So I thought I would just kind of talk about that a little bit. It might feel a little disjointed and random, but just stick with me. And I'm sure we'll have some time at the end. I have no idea how long this talk is going to take, but probably have some time at the end to answer questions about renunciation or questions about Rohatsu if you're thinking about going and have never been. Kind of anything is open there. So just kind of my own sort of thoughts about renunciation. I think, for example, that kind of this time of year, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, is a perfect time for Rohatsu. I always find myself, I think it's just a natural progression of the season, kind of wanting to withdraw and turn in. I'm an introvert by nature, but I'm even less social in the winter. So, I get home from work and all I can think about is curling up in my bed with a book. So I was also kind of wondering, I wonder what, like this time of year in Australia, for example, it's late spring. And so I wonder how Rohatsu feels as you're moving toward the light rather than moving toward the dark. It's just something to think about. A winter, late fall, winter, it's a season of darkness. Some of us like it, some of us don't. It's kind of immaterial whether we like it or not, because there it is. But, it naturally sort of invites us or offers us into a meditative state, kind of a relaxation state for mind and body. I know that I want to sleep way more than I'm able to, given my work schedule and so on. It's a time to become more introspective. And of course, everyone is different. Some people suffer from, seasonal affective disorder and various things like that. There are ways to cope with that. But I just think that, this time, despite the fact that it's a beautiful day out and it's sunny, it's kind of a little teaser. But it is. Someone was telling me there was some meme that was going around on the internet at the time of the time change. Hello, darkness, my old friend. Now you come at 5 p.m. So, yeah, you do. Actually, more like 4:30. So that's just kind of what I wanted to sort of kind of put that out there. It's kind of my own feelings about renunciation, kind of feeling this need to kind of let go of a lot of activity. The Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron, I just was really struck by this piece that she wrote. It was an article generally about renunciation, but she wrote that she saw a poster in a medical office or something. The poster was of an old Native American woman walking along a road, holding the hand of a child. You can kind of maybe bring that image into your mind. And the caption of the poster was, "The seasons come and go, summer follows spring, and fall follows summer, and winter follows fall, and human beings are born and mature, they have their middle age, they begin to grow older and die, and everything has its cycles. Day follows night, night follows day. It is good to be a part of all this." I just was really struck by that. We get to be a part of all this change and shift. So maybe that's not related to renunciation, but I kind of think it is, because we can realize that we're a part of all that shifting and moving and changing and trying to find a sort of a protected, perfect place. I actually was reflecting this morning, I have never lived in a climate that is warm all year round, never have. Probably never will at this point. I was born in Ohio. I grew up mostly in the Southeast, which was still cold in the winter, and Idaho as a teenager, and the Pacific Northwest since I was 21. So, I've always kind of lived in a coldish, darkish place. So it's kind of like I'm very used to it. I don't know what I would do if I was in a tropical climate. Probably would love it, actually, but maybe. In any case, but this kind of recognition of these cycles invites us to give up being in this kind of protected, special place. If you're familiar with one of our chants, Affirming Faith and Mind, it kind of occurred to me as I was thinking about this that the opening lines of Affirming Faith and Mind are in fact speaking about renunciation. And I for some reason I never thought of it this way, but I'll just read those lines to you. The supreme way is not difficult if only you do not pick and choose. Neither love nor hate, and you will clearly understand. Be off by a hair, and you are as far from it as heaven from earth. If you want the way to appear, be neither for nor against. For and against opposing each other, this is the mind's dis-ease. Without recognizing the mysterious principle, it just really struck me this time, the mysterious principle, it is useless to practice quietude. So that whole section to me is like, oh, that's about renunciation. So, just putting that out there. Let's see, where do I want to go next? I know Ejo was talking a little bit last week about some of the stories about the Buddha's home leaving. And the things that I was reading last night and very early this morning were that this, in general, this is referred to as the great departure or the great renunciation, when he decided to leave home. And there are lots of versions of this story, and most of them go like this. It's a little bit long, but I think it's worth hearing the whole thing. So this is, the prince leaves home. The king, Siddhartha's father, arranged a grand dinner and dance for the prince to celebrate the birth of Rahula, which was the Buddha's child. Invited were the best dancers, singers, and musicians in the country. It was not just out of joy that the king arranged the celebration. He could see that the prince was depressed and that his new baby son was not giving him happiness. The king was afraid Siddhartha was planning to leave the palace for good, and for the last time did his best to distract him away from his somber reflections and back to the abundance of palace life. The prince attended the party just to please his father. During the dinner, the most delicious food was served, the most enchanting and beautiful dancing girls in the country performed, the most sensitive musicians played, and the finest puppets and magicians performed incredible feats. But Siddhartha, this is my favorite line, but Siddhartha was so tired from thinking that he soon fell asleep. When the singers and the dancers saw this, they too stopped and fell asleep. Sometime later that night, the prince awoke and was shocked to see these sleeping people. What a sight! All the prettiest, most charming dancing girls, the finest singers, best musicians, and cleverest performers in the country who, hours ago, were trying to make the prince so happy, were now all over the floor of the room in the most ugly, shameful, and loathsome positions. Some people were snoring like pigs, with their mouths wide open, some grinding and chewing their teeth like hungry devils. We're not very pretty when we're asleep or hungover. This alteration in their appearance made the prince even more disgusted and unhappy. How oppressive and stifling this all is, he thought, and his mind turned again towards leaving the palace. He got up quietly from the room and, waking Channa, who was his assistant, asked for his horse, Kantaka, to be saddled. As Channa was preparing his horse, Siddhartha went quietly to see his newborn son for the first time. His wife was sleeping with the baby beside her her hand resting on the baby's head. The prince said to himself, "If I try to move her hand so I can take the child for one last cuddle, I fear I will wake her and she will prevent me from going. No, I must go, but when I have found what I am looking for, I shall come back and see him and his mother again." Quietly then, Siddhartha left the palace. It was midnight, and the prince was on his white horse Kantaka, with Channa, his faithful servant, holding on to its tail. Nobody stopped him as he rode away from all who knew, respected, and loved him. He took a last look at the city of Kapilavastu, sleeping so quietly in the moonlight. He was going away to learn to understand old age, sickness, and death. He rode to the bank of the river Anoma and dismounted from his horse. He removed his jewelry and princely clothes and gave them to Channa to return to the king. Then the prince took his sword and cut his long hair, donned simple clothes, took a begging bowl, and asked Channa to go back with Kantaka. "It is no use living in the palace without you, my master," said Channa very sadly. "I want to follow you." But Siddhartha would not allow him to stay, although Channa asked 3 times. At last Channa started to go, but Kantaka refused. The horse refused. The prince talked to the horse very kindly. "Please, Kantaka, go with my friend. Don't wait for me." But Kantaka thought, "I shall never see my master again." Tears rolled down from the horse's eyes as he kept them fixed on the prince, until he turned to go away and walked out of sight. As Siddhartha disappeared over the horizon, so Kantaka's heart burst, and he died of sorrow. Interesting. What do you think of that story? I mean, anybody? Where do you hear in it? What resonates with you or not?
The horse died.
I know. The horse died. I hadn't heard that one before. Where the horse died. That's so interesting that the horse died.
He abandoned his son.
He abandoned his son. Yes, he did. And I'll say more about that later. That's always a big one for our ears, is that he abandoned his wife and child.
I heard the intention beyond the intention with regard to that, though.
Mm-hmm.
That he said, when I find what I'm looking for, I'm coming back.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I've never heard of him coming back, though. Did he come back?
I mean, there's probably, hundreds of versions of this story, and some of them they're very different. Another one that I read, it just says, let's see, I'll just read the last paragraph. Having said this, he mounted the white horse, and with Channa holding his tail firmly, the one of great strength, having come close to the main gate, thought thus, "If the door is not opened by anyone, then together with Channa holding on to the tail, I will grip Kantaka with my thighs and jump over this tall, beautiful wall and depart." Channa, who was endowed with firm strength, and Kantaka, the supreme horse, both thought of overcoming the wall in the same way. Then, having understood the Bodhisattva's mind, the gods who were in possession of the door, rejoicing in the auspicious departure, opened the door. And then after that happens, it goes straight to Mara. So, straight, it's kind of like they missed a whole bunch of stuff in between. So it's just, I don't know how there's so many of these stories, so they're all a little bit different. So maybe he did come back, maybe he didn't. We always kind of think of again, in our modern ears, I think, and I know Hojo-san mentioned this last week, it's like, bad Buddha, leaving your wife and child, but again, we didn't live at that time. We don't know what that was like. Yeah, you were going to say something?
It was more that Rahula came and joined him. He was his first disciple.
Yeah.
Correct, yes. Eventually that did happen, yes. Rahula and Yasodhara both, I believe.
Mm-hmm. I hear a lot of sadness. He's already entered into suffering by just leaving his world and knowing probably that his horse died and that his assistant was really grieved.
Yeah. You were going to say something?
That Rahula was his first.
Yeah, he one of his first disciples, yeah.
He's egotistical.
He's egotistical?
Yeah.
How so? Say more.
Well, I'm gonna get enlightened and screw with other people. my wife and, my kid. That's selfish.
Yeah, well, and I don't have any quotations from them, but I did read in some of the Theravada Polycanon, they do talk about him being only in it for himself. And that it wasn't until later that it came to be seen as an altruistic move. Now, again, I don't know when these were written. Some of these are very old. Maybe that's how it appeared to them at the time. I don't know. Or maybe that was an important piece of it. Maybe it was important. Yeah.
I hear a couple of things in that. I mean, one is, especially certain teachers now talk about how we take up this path because we want to make things better for all beings. I don't think that's why most people take up this path. People take up this path because they want to feel better.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point.
And over the course of practicing, what you come to realize, as the Buddha did, is that there is no making myself better that doesn't involve caring for and serving all beings. And I see that same path that we take. And I also see a story, like a lot of stories, that says this is an extreme, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're going to talk about renunciation and how this path is inherently a path of renunciation. And this is what are the extremes that it might feel like? Not that we have to do all those things.
Right.
But to contemplate, what would that mean? What is that kind of renunciation? And it might, we might go, or it might speak to us, but just to explore that extreme.
I think it's a really good point, and I think the way you say about we all start out practice with a purely, maybe selfish is kind of a strong word, but we're not thinking about all beings when we start necessarily. Maybe some are, but the sutras would have evolved that way as well, right? Mm-hmm. So it may have started out that the Buddha was in it for himself, and that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. And then the sutras evolved along with the practice and the realization that, I can only go so far in satisfying myself. And it leaves me wanting and realizing that this is more than about me. That's a really good point.
Were you finished?
Yeah.
Well, I agree that with some of what you just said, Jiki, around people not thinking of freeing all beings when they step on the path or take the vows. But personally, it was not to feel better. I didn't do that.
Mm-hmm.
I was a therapist, so I already had, this.
You had tools to feel better already.
I had an exaggerated belief in the efficacy of so I thought it was limited. But for me, it was an inquiry. It was a search for truth, for clarity around these issues. I didn't know particularly about benefiting myself, but nor was it a quest to help others. But the way I understand his home leaving, in terms of his own motivation, it was from seeing the suffering of others. It was not a solitary realization that I'm suffering. As the stories, as I have heard them, about seeing old age and death and so on, that it is the suffering of others that inspires his quest. Right. So I think that question of was he selfish or was he? I don't think it's actually a question here. Yeah. It's interesting. If we believe, have belief, or if we are inspired by this story, then it seems to me to take it up in that way, that his experience motivates him, the suffering of others, right? Because he didn't know people suffered.
And that's the classic stories say that he'd never seen old age, sickness, and death ever because his father sheltered him, because his father didn't want him to become a teacher. His father wanted him to be a king, and so in order to keep him. So the father knew that if he went out into the world, he'd probably become a spiritual teacher, given the prediction of the astrological prediction at his birth that said, just for the benefit of those who are not familiar with the story, when the Buddha was born, an astrological prediction was made that he would either be a king or a great spiritual teacher. And Dad nope. Dad says, nope, you're going to be a king. So I'm going to keep you sheltered so that you'll be a king. But the Buddha was curious. Inquiry. The Buddha was curious. He wanted to leave the palace walls. And there's something I was going to say about that. I can't remember. That's okay. Yes, thank you. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think it sort of emphasizes for me the concept that renunciation and discovery is always seems to be a function of luxury and privilege.
That, and that is interesting. And what do people think about that? Because the Buddha very clearly was living in luxury and privilege, and he gave it up. What of those who are not? In one of these sutras, I don't have it here, but the Buddha talks about going out, and he's riding on his horse, and he's going out, and he sees the sunburned faces of the workers in the field, and the cows laboring under their burdens, and all of these kinds of things. And would the thought of leaving even occur when you don't have the material luxury to do so? And the other side of that too, I think about this. He did leave his wife and son, but they were going to be taken care of. He wasn't abandoning them to poverty. They were being well cared for in the palace. He didn't need to worry. Good point. Yes.
It's always been fascinating to me that the Buddha, who was probably quite educated in his palace life, it hadn't occurred to him that old age, sickness, and death occurs when his own mother died in childbirth.
Well, he wouldn't have.
Just
Well,
for
I guess
starters.
if it's the Buddha, he would have remembered, but most people don't remember.
Well,
yeah. True.
no,
That.
but he would have heard the story.
Of course,
Where's
yes,
his mother?
yes,
His
yes.
mother is dead.
Correct.
Oh, what's that about?
Mhm.
Okay, he would have heard that. So that's always been kind of an intriguing edit to a good story.
Yeah.
The second piece that I'm thinking of is I listened to the story that you read about the king saying, "Oh, my son is depressed. He's never." I mean, that was an interesting word.
This is obviously a rewrite of an ancient sutra.
My son is depressed. He doesn't smile when he picks up his son. It's very, very. It's a form of postpartum depression for the dude, right? And it's very, very common. People don't understand it. It's quite common for first-time dads to fantasize bailing because it's too much, and they don't get the hormonal thing that mom does, which is also too much. But dads think it's very
Yeah, that is
common.
kind of interesting.
It's very common on a clinical.
Probably a lot of subtext here that.
Yeah. So I listened to that story as though it was an assessment session, and clearly the man's depressed. He's got too much change going on in his life. He decides to bail, and he has the means to do it.
He has the means to do it. Yeah,
Right.
I think that's a key. Yeah.
I just want to note that he's not free of oppression, though he lives in privilege and luxury. He's experiencing oppression because these two paths are in the stars for him, but his father truncates that path, which exacerbates an experience of depression.
Yeah, so I think that might be part of the point about living in luxury is that even that doesn't bring total happiness, even though if you're not living in luxury, it seems like it will, so. Yeah, very interesting, yeah.
I don't really have a hard time imagining the shock that an individual who was brought up in that kind of wealth and privilege and beauty and every aspect of your life in terms of the servants and the food you eat, and the kind of palace you live in, and the way it looks, that just, if you really started an inquiry, if you really slipped out, I mean, I'm sure he was aware of death, it would be different inside the palace than going to the streets and seeing, a leper or somebody who's really ill lying on the sidewalk, and the way people struggle just to eat, and the kind of, it's shocking. Given that life, and so that shock of this, really witnessing the suffering of most people, the ordinary people.
Most people, sure.
Could really turn your brain to these thoughts. What is real life about? What is it really all about for these people?
Right.
This is all dancing girls and silks and perfumes
Right,
inside
right.
these walls, but most of the world is not living that.
No.
So that could really trigger for us a person who was sensitive,
Mm-hmm.
a real desire to penetrate the meaning of life. I think. I mean, that's the way.
Yeah, and these are stories. They're set up in a particular way. I mean, I think about how have we come now in our modern times? We turn a blind eye. Not necessarily us here, but in general, we turn a blind eye to the suffering in our own community. It doesn't faze us. Oh, there's just. I think I was going out somewhere last night, and it wasn't even that late, but it was dark, and there were just people who would just like run across the street on 7th, just because they were probably unhoused folks. They'd had, burdens and so on, but they were just, I'm like, oh my God, you're going to get hit. But it's just, but there's, the people are out at night. And we just, in general, we turn a blind eye to that in this community as a whole. And the fact that one could be touched by that and want to seek a quest to live a better life, I don't know what that would mean now, but just a thought. Anybody else? Yeah.
I think it's my background in another faith tradition, but I keep hearing this on such a symbolic level.
Mm-hmm.
The inner quest and how one renounces external comforts, and even at times, like there are practical considerations day to day that you would have to, even if you have a child in the house, but you're trying to practice those and the ways in which you are leave-taking from the normal relational mix. And it's not to diminish the power of this story, but to for me at least, it speaks to how much true heartache and difficult decision goes into the quest to really come to terms with the suffering that is here, and that it will put you in impossible situations at times, or what feels like it, all with the desire, I think, of climate change and my young son. How do I live now that may even keep me out of reach in the day-to-day, because in the end I want to meet up with him. I want to do the longer path, kind of, I feel like what he was doing. What's the bigger question? What am I bequeathing my son?
Right. I mean, I think that's a really alive question for all of us alive now who have, I don't have young children anymore. I do have adult children. I have a grandchild, so it's like, I think about that actually quite a bit. When I'm gone, and I hopefully at least 30 more years, so I won't know. And so what is my responsibility now to that? What do I give up? So, and that could be one way to look at the Buddha's story. What is he going to give up to on this, whether it was his own enlightenment or the enlightenment, the benefit of all beings, whatever it was, he started it, at least in this tradition. I think Christian had a question. Yeah.
Thank you. I want to hold space for still being a little mad at the Buddha.
Okay, fair enough.
Because, obviously I love the guy I'm in here, but when I think about the story, and I don't know if anyone has this sense, but I hear about the dancing girls and the wealth and the privilege and the luxury, and it doesn't matter. Because we're destroying a family. At least that's the feeling I get. An action like this would destroy his family. And I want to hold space because there are often times when you do pick a spiritual path, when you do see the suffering in the world, you have to make choices that feel exactly like that. And sometimes it's true. Like leaving a faith, or saying that this is right and it will hurt people. It's an incredibly difficult position, and probably the most important decisions we make have a tinge of this.
Yeah.
So I want to be angry at Buddha because I'm sure he was very angry at himself on some level.
Yeah. Well, this is a perfect segue into another story about this incident that's very, very different, and one that I'd never heard before. I just have to find it. So this is from apparently a Theravada tradition. I don't know which sutra it's in. And it's not the verbatim from the sutra, it's a rewrite, but in any case, in the middle of the night, Siddhartha prepares to leave the palace. But as he passes his wife Yashodhara's room and sees her sleeping figure, he is overcome by her beauty and his love for her. He can't leave. He goes to her without telling her of his resolve, and they make love, conceiving their only child. Yashodhara senses Siddhartha's impending distance. "Lord, wherever you go, take me with you," she pleads. "So be it," he replies. "Wherever I go, I will take you." By morning, he is gone. From that night on, Gautama's spiritual quest is mirrored by the course of Yashodhara's pregnancy. Both go on for 6 years and culminate during the same fateful night. Both Gautama and Yashodhara, in their very different circumstances, practice austerities, eating only 1 sesame seed, 1 grain of rice, and 1 pulse pod a day. And for both, the period of asceticism is grim and unsuccessful. Gautama nearly dies, and Yashodhara almost loses the child. When Gautama accepts solid food again, Yashodhara does too, and the child is saved. Gautama sits under the bo tree full of strength and determination. Yashodhara enters labor. Gautama is then tempted by Mara, while Yashodhara in the palace receives a messenger from Mara who tells her that her husband has died, and she, overcome with grief again, almost loses the child. But at that moment, when the former prince is about to enter enlightenment, Yashodhara hears the truth, recovers, and gives birth to their son Rahula at the eclipse of the moon. I've never heard that one before. I just think it's fascinating.
So she was pregnant for 6 years.
That's what it says. Yes.
Yeah.
Here's the interesting thing. I mean, I found this in an article written by Norman Fisher, so I think it's fair to read his commentary on it because I think it's really interesting. The Buddha does leave home, and Yashodhara does stay. So his title of the piece is "Leaving Home or Leaving Home, Staying Home." They give each other up, and each must pursue his or her own path with full devotion. As a result of this opting with full commitment to the path taken, fruition comes about. Inner and outer birth ensue. But I think, or Norman Fisher thinks, the story, read on a structural level, is not simply about, on one hand, the Buddha and his solitary heroic quest for enlightenment, and on the other hand, the girl he leaves behind. Structurally, the story is clearly presented as a single narrative with 2 halves. The implication is that enlightenment of the Buddha isn't something that happens to him or is affected by him alone. Nothing in the way that particular story is told privileges Siddhartha over Yashodhara. It's quite clear that it is the whole situation, both the outer birth and the inner turning, that describes the fullness of the path. Leaving home and staying home, renouncing the world and accepting the world, are seen here as parts of a seamless whole. We can't have it all. One path is particular, and as such, always involves renunciation. In the story, the Buddha is a renunciant, but so is Yashodhara. The Buddha gives up the home life, but Yashodhara gives up the homeless life. Together, through loss of each other and devotion to the particularity of their own paths, they create the whole of enlightenment. Both appreciate the world as it really is. I just love that. Such an interesting take on the story. We always hear about dun da da da, the heroic path and the horse dying, and here it is put in a really different context of, wait a second, he didn't just say, see you later, and leave. I mean, that's kind of I'll just say it, it's kind of the male perspective, that he leaves her behind, and well, she'll be taken care of, so it's fine if I go, and even there's another piece of it. If we have a few minutes, it's in some of the older sutras, there are people who are complaining that the ascetic Gautama gets along by breaking up families. So it definitely was a criticism in his own time. There's another sutra that this person references. It depicts a young monk sitting in meditation. His former wife comes to him with their young son and says, "Support me and our son, ascetic." 3 times she makes this appeal, but he does not even look up. So you could see the kind of the conflict in these kinds of situations. It was, and again, it was really common for men to leave their households in that time in India. And I always have to remind myself that there's no way I can be in that mindset of people who lived that long ago. But to the point being, the story that Yashodhara has as much involvement in this as the Buddha does, I think is really important. Yeah.
Well, and I think it seems to speak to the liberation comes from renunciation also, because it maybe can put you more in touch with independent interdependence, interbeing, and that these two paths were really one path, and there's really no leaving, right?
Yeah.
It's
right, and then again, Yashodhara and Rahula become the Buddhist students. You were going to say something, did you hear?
I love that. That's such a Mahayana story.
Yeah.
Of a Theravada tradition. But I think it points us back that the details of this story and how alien it feels to us in our world is one thing, but when we say this is a path of renunciation, we aren't talking about this is a path for people who leave home like the Buddha did and not for people who don't, right? Even in our particular lineage, we call priests home leavers, but our home leaver is home with his wife. His children and grandchildren live on the street, right? We don't mean someone who doesn't have a family and have attachment. So I think it's good to keep it pointed back to us. What does renunciation mean in my life? And I love that right at the beginning you said letting go of activity. Because that's it at the core, right? And what does that mean in my life?
Right.
Not am I going to do what this historical figure did.
Right.
What does it mean in my life?
Yeah, I didn't bring it downstairs. On my Rohatsu, on the back of it, it has I think it's from the affirming faith in mind. When activity stops, there is no rest. So it's just like, okay.
I appreciate that you read the Shinshin Ming, the first
section.
Because that's pointing us to the heart of what the Buddha uncovered.
Yeah.
Renunciation is not about leaving home or not leaving home. It's about letting go of the pushing and pulling the world around to try and get try and serve ourselves.
Yeah.
And that doesn't require privilege.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't require privilege.
Anyone.
It doesn't require privilege. Yeah.
Well, ultimately, isn't renunciation moving beyond delusion? Isn't that what's being renounced?
I think so. Certainly, ultimately, yeah. Ultimately realizing that that we get all of it. Like in the quote from the beginning, we are born. We live a life. We get old. We die. Isn't it great to be a part of all of this? We're a part of all of it.
Well, coming to that conclusion might be a goal of the path.
Indeed. It's not always fun, is it?
Well,
Yeah. Anyone else?
Like just having a little, like maybe looking at the Buddha as Christian mentioned, like where are the strong attachments in the story that reflect love and the way that people really evolve, is through strong attachment and connection to each other. And there's something in the second story that resonates more with that, like, you can evolve when you feel fully supported in your own love for the world, humanity, each other. And, trying to see things through that lens of love is what occurred to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I didn't make a note of it here, but in the same article, I can't remember which one it was. I read so many between last night and this morning. But one of them was saying that in the Buddha's time, I mean, you just have to hear this for what it is. In the Buddha's time, a wife and children were considered a man's property. And they were considered his most valuable property, the thing that was nearest and dearest and most important to him. So that leaving was a huge sacrifice and a huge, I mean, you know, it's not like you schlum, you know, you just left. It was more like, wow. He was at least from the way I read that is at his time, leaving wife and family was a huge act of sacrifice, and it took a lot of, you know, maybe they would have put it as great courage to do so. You know, so it's just kind of interesting to, you know, it's like it wasn't just like he left because he didn't care or that he didn't want to deal with it anymore. He left because there was something he had to do that, you know, I think we can say now that would benefit everyone, including them. And he did. I think he went back.
Yeah.
Or she came back anyway. She went to him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
It's just really interesting.
It also makes me think about how maybe even the idea of love has changed.
Mm.
This idea that there's property and I take care of you and it has to do with things and money and that you're okay, versus the idea of supporting someone's spiritual growth.
Mm-hmm.
And how to love someone in that way and to look at your child and think, in this way I cannot provide that. I can only provide these other things.
Yeah, I like that.
And taking the kind of social context of how you will be viewed,
Mm-hmm.
and every time it has to do with your kid, that is just the ultimate sacrifice.
Mhm.
And, you know, and then taking the social context with it.
Yeah,
is how
interesting.
Anyu makes it.
Yeah, one more, I think.
Well, I think we're looking at all of this through a 21st century
Absolutely.
view.
There's no way we can't.
You can't look at it from where they were, because men at that time, they lived up. They could kill their wives. They were their property. They had dancing girls. They had mistresses.
Yeah,
This
sure.
was, you know, a wife was very important, but you could also have children by numerous other women.
Sure.
You know,
Sure.
and we're looking at this as our love for our wife, our love for our child.
At least in the
possible.
West, there are parts of the world that still do those things.
Yes,
but
it's very
in general,
possible that
yeah.
this marriage was arranged and that this was
Sure.
not a love match to begin with. I'm not
Who
saying that
knows?
it was a love match
Yeah.
when he left,
Yeah,
but you know, most marriages were arranged for property or political value.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Very complex. I think I'll just take. Did you have something? Yeah.
No, it's my job here. It's 11:30.
It's your job.
7.
Okay, so
Okay.
I'm sorry. It's 11:30. You have 11:37?
Yeah.
Oh dear, I only have 11:32.
I have
Okay. In any case, it's past 11:30. So we'll close. Thank you all.